My fiancé told me his ex would be attending our wedding out of respect for their history, then added her to the rehearsal dinner list without mentioning it to me. My fiancé just told me his ex-girlfriend is coming to our wedding because he owes her that much for their history together. I didn't even know he was still in contact with her until he brought this up 3 weeks before we're supposed to get married, and now I'm finding out she's also on the rehearsal dinner list without him ever mentioning it to me. We've been together for 4 years, engaged for 8 months, wedding is in 3 weeks, I'm 29F and he's 31M, his name is Derek and mine is Vanessa, we met through mutual friends at a barbecue and clicked immediately, he proposed at the beach where we had our first real conversation about wanting the same things in life, I thought we were on the same page about everything. 2 nights ago Derek came home from work and sat down at the kitchen table with this weird expression. I was chopping vegetables for dinner and he just cleared his throat and said we needed to talk about the guest list. I assumed maybe he wanted to add a coworker or cut someone to save money since we'd been stressing about the budget. Instead he told me that Simone would be attending the wedding. I stopped chopping. The name didn't even register at first because he never talks about his exes. I asked who Simone was and he got uncomfortable. He said she was someone he dated for 3 years in his mid-20s and they'd remained friendly over the years. I put the knife down because I couldn't hold it steady anymore. He'd never mentioned staying in touch with an ex and definitely never mentioned someone named Simone in 4 years together. I asked why this was the first time I was hearing about her and he got defensive. He said it wasn't a secret but it also wasn't relevant because they were just friends who occasionally texted. I asked how occasionally and he said maybe once every few months to check in. Then I asked why she needed to come to our wedding if they barely talked and he said it felt wrong not to invite her given how important she was during a formative time in his life. That phrasing made me want to throw up. Formative time in his life, like she shaped who he became. I asked if he'd already invited her and he admitted he'd mentioned it to her 2 weeks ago and she'd said yes, so this wasn't even a discussion. He'd already decided and extended the invitation without asking me first. Everything tilted sideways for a second. Derek tried to backtrack. He said he thought I'd understand because I'm usually so reasonable about things. He said Simone was a good person who wished us well and there was nothing romantic between them anymore. I asked why he didn't tell me 2 weeks ago when he invited her and he said he didn't want me to stress with everything else going on, which made it worse because that meant he knew I'd have a problem with it. I asked if she was bringing a date and he said no, she was recently single. I just stared at him because why would a recently single ex-girlfriend need to attend our wedding out of respect for their history? I asked where she was sitting and he said probably with his college friends since she knew some of them from back when they were together, so she'd be integrated into his friend group at our wedding. We didn't finish making dinner. I sat down across from him and asked what else I didn't know. He looked genuinely confused and said there wasn't anything else. I asked if she was coming to the rehearsal dinner and he paused too long before answering. That pause told me everything. He finally admitted that yes, she was on the rehearsal dinner list because his mom had suggested it. His mom suggested it. That meant his mother knew about Simone being invited before I did. I asked when his mom got involved in our wedding guest list and Derek said she'd asked if Simone was coming because she always liked her. Apparently his parents stayed in touch with his ex after they broke up. This was getting worse by the second. I asked why they broke up and Derek said it was mutual. They wanted different things at the time. She was focused on her career and he wanted to settle down sooner. He said they ended on good terms and stayed friendly because there was no bad blood. I asked if he'd ever thought about getting back together with her and he said no, not since we met, which implied he had thought about it before me. Derek reached across the table to take my hand but I pulled back. I told him this was a massive breach of trust. He'd hidden a relationship with his ex for 4 years and then unilaterally decided she should be at our wedding and rehearsal dinner without consulting me. He said he hadn't hidden anything, he just didn't think it mattered because it was in the past, but clearly it wasn't in the past if she was actively involved in our wedding. I asked if anyone else knew. He admitted that his best man knew because Simone was friends with him too, so Derek's entire inner circle knew about this woman except me. I was completely blindsided, like I'd been planning a wedding with someone I didn't actually know. He kept insisting there was nothing to worry about but wouldn't acknowledge why he'd kept this from me. That night I slept in the guest room. Derek texted me around midnight saying he was sorry for springing it on me but he really thought I'd be okay with it. He said Simone meant a lot to his family and it would mean a lot to him if I could be understanding about this. The text made me furious because he was framing my reaction as me being unreasonable rather than him being secretive. The next morning I called my best friend Lauren and told her everything. She was just as shocked as I was. She asked if I'd ever seen him texting Simone and I realized I hadn't, which meant he was careful about when and how he communicated with her. Lauren said that was a red flag because why hide it if it was innocent? I told her I didn't know what to do with the wedding so close. I decided to look Simone up on social media. I found her pretty quickly because Derek's mom follows her on Instagram. Derek doesn't use social media much and I'd never thought to look through his mom's following list since she follows hundreds of people. Simone's profile was public, so I scrolled through. There were photos of her at charity events and hiking trips and brunches with friends. She looked happy and successful and exactly like someone Derek's family would love. Then I found a photo from 4 months ago. It was Simone and Derek's mom at a restaurant together. The caption said something about catching up with favorite people, which meant they'd seen each other recently, and Derek never mentioned it. I got nauseous looking at it. His mother was actively maintaining a relationship with his ex-girlfriend while I was planning a wedding to her son. I screenshotted the photo and sent it to Derek with a message asking when he was going to tell me about this. He called immediately. He sounded panicked and said his mom had run into Simone at a work event and they'd grabbed lunch. He said it wasn't a big deal and he didn't mention it because nothing happened. I asked why his mom was having lunch with his ex, and he said they'd always gotten along. Like that explained everything. I told him I wanted Simone uninvited from both the wedding and the rehearsal dinner. Derek went silent for a long time and then said he didn't think that was fair to her. She'd already RSVP'd and made plans to travel for it. I asked if he was seriously prioritizing his ex-girlfriend's convenience over my comfort at our own wedding, and he said that wasn't what he was doing, but he didn't want to be rude to someone who'd been part of his life. We went back and forth for an hour. I was at work sitting in my car during lunch break and crying while he tried to convince me I was overreacting. He kept saying I should trust him and that Simone being there wouldn't change anything about our day. I asked how I was supposed to trust him when he'd hidden this entire relationship from me for 4 years, and he didn't have a good answer. Finally, I told him I needed space to think and hung up. I sat in my car until my lunch break was over and then went back inside and pretended everything was fine, but I couldn't focus on anything. All I could think about was walking down the aisle while Derek's ex-girlfriend watched from the audience and his mom smiled at both of us. That evening Derek came home with flowers. He apologized for not being upfront about Simone from the beginning. He said he should have told me years ago that they stayed in touch, but he didn't think it was important, and then it seemed weird to bring up later. He promised there was nothing between them and that he loved me and only wanted to marry me. I asked if he'd uninvite her and he said he'd think about it, which wasn't the answer I wanted. The next day I got a text from an unknown number. It was Simone. She said Derek gave her my number and she wanted to reach out directly. She said she was sorry for any confusion and that she only wanted to celebrate us because Derek was important to her. She said there was nothing romantic between them and she hoped we could all be adults about this. I stared at that text for 20 minutes. The tone was so condescending, like I was a child having a tantrum instead of a bride who just found out her fiancé's ex was invited to the wedding without her knowledge. I didn't respond. I showed Derek the text when he got home and asked why he gave Simone my number. He said he thought it might help if she explained directly, like that would fix everything. Update 1 week later. I didn't think things could get more complicated, but here we are. The wedding is now 2 weeks away and I'm seriously considering calling the whole thing off. Not just postponing but actually ending the engagement because of what I found out about Derek and Simone. After Simone texted me I ignored it for 2 days. Derek kept asking if I'd responded and I kept saying no. He seemed frustrated that I wasn't willing to communicate with her, like I was being difficult on purpose. Meanwhile I was drowning in wedding tasks and trying to figure out if I even wanted to marry someone who clearly didn't prioritize my feelings. 3 days after that initial conversation Derek sat me down again. He said he'd been thinking about it and he understood why I was upset, but he still didn't think uninviting Simone was the right move. He said it would create drama and hurt feelings when we were so close to the wedding. I asked whose feelings he was worried about and he said everyone's. His mom was excited to see Simone again and his friends were looking forward to catching up with her. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Simone attending. This was about Derek's entire social circle expecting her to be there. I asked how many people knew she was coming and he admitted most of his family and college friends knew because she'd been part of that world for years. So I was the outsider in this situation, the fiancé who didn't understand the group dynamic. I told Derek I was humiliated by all of this. He tried to hug me but I stepped back. I said if Simone was so important to everyone maybe he should have married her instead. He looked hurt and said that wasn't fair. I told him nothing about this situation was fair and I needed him to choose. Either she came and I'd have to live with being disrespected at my own wedding, or he uninvited her and dealt with whatever fallout came from that. Derek said he'd talk to his mom, which wasn't what I asked for but it was something. He left to go to his parents' house and I stayed home wondering how we got here. We'd been so happy 8 months ago when he proposed. I thought I knew him completely. Now I was marrying someone who had this whole other life I wasn't part of. He came back 3 hours later and he looked exhausted. He said his mom was upset that I was making this into a bigger issue than it needed to be. Apparently she'd told him I was being insecure and that wasn't attractive in a partner. I asked if he defended me and he said he tried to explain my perspective but his mom insisted Simone was practically family. Those exact words, practically family. I started laughing because it was so absurd. His ex-girlfriend was practically family, but I was the one being unreasonable. Derek didn't understand why I was laughing. I told him his mother just chose his ex over me and he didn't even see the problem. He said his mom wasn't choosing anyone. She just had a long history with Simone and didn't see why that had to end because we were getting married. I asked Derek point blank if he'd ever told his family to stop contacting Simone after we got together. He admitted he hadn't because he didn't think he had the right to control who his family talked to, which technically was true but also showed he never established boundaries between his past relationship and our current one. His family still treated Simone like she was part of their lives because Derek never indicated she shouldn't be. That night I called my mom. She's usually pretty level-headed about relationship stuff, but even she was shocked. She asked if I'd met Simone before and I said no, never even heard her name until a week ago. My mom said that was concerning and asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with the wedding. I told her I didn't know anymore. I loved Derek, but I didn't know if I could trust him. The next morning I woke up to a missed call from Derek's mom. She'd called at 7 in the morning, which was unusual. I didn't call back immediately. I made coffee and sat on the balcony trying to mentally prepare for whatever conversation was coming. Around 9 I finally called her back. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was tight and overly polite. She said she wanted to clear the air about Simone. I told her I was listening. She launched into this long explanation about how Simone had been there for Derek during a very difficult time in his life. Apparently his dad had health issues 6 years ago and Simone was supportive and helpful with the family. His mom said she'd always be grateful for that. I understood being grateful, but I didn't understand why that meant Simone needed to be at our wedding. I said that to her directly. There was a long pause and then she said she was disappointed in my attitude. She said marriage was about joining families and accepting everyone who came before. I asked if she'd want her husband's ex at their wedding and she said that was different. When I pressed her on how it was different, she couldn't give me a real answer. The call ended badly. She said she hoped I'd mature before the wedding and hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone after being scolded by a future mother-in-law who clearly didn't respect me. I called Derek immediately and told him what happened. He sighed and said his mom was old-fashioned and didn't always communicate well. I said this wasn't a communication issue. This was a respect issue. Derek promised he'd talk to her again, but I could tell he was exhausted from being in the middle. Part of me understood that was difficult, but a bigger part of me was angry that he'd created this situation by hiding Simone in the first place. If he'd been honest from the start, we could have addressed this years ago. 2 days later I was at the venue doing a final walkthrough with the coordinator. Everything looked beautiful and exactly how I'd imagined it. White flowers everywhere and string lights and the perfect view of the water. I should have been excited, but all I had was dread. I kept picturing Simone sitting in the audience watching Derek watch me walk down the aisle. My phone buzzed while I was looking at the seating chart. It was a text from Lauren asking if I'd made a decision about Simone. I told her Derek still hadn't uninvited her and I was running out of time. She asked if I'd considered calling off the wedding and I admitted I had, but I didn't know if I was overreacting or if this was a legitimate deal breaker. That evening Derek and I had dinner at home. It was tense and quiet. Halfway through the meal he said he'd talked to Simone and asked her to consider not coming. I perked up because I thought maybe he'd finally prioritized me, but then he said she was hurt and confused about why I had such a problem with her. She told him she'd think about it, but she'd already booked her hotel and flight. I put my fork down. I asked Derek why he phrased it as me having a problem with her instead of him recognizing he should have consulted me before inviting her. He said that wasn't how he meant it, but clearly that was how Simone understood it because now she thought I was the villain in this situation. I told Derek I was done trying to be understanding about this. Either he uninvited her directly or I wasn't showing up to the wedding. He stared at me. I could see him trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't. I'd spent the last week anxious and disrespected and I wasn't going to start my marriage that way. Derek said I was being extreme and I said maybe I was, but this was my boundary. He got up from the table and left the apartment. Didn't say where he was going. Just grabbed his keys and walked out. He came back 4 hours later. I'd been sitting on the couch the entire time trying not to panic about what this meant for us. He sat down next to me and said he'd uninvited Simone. She was upset and his mom was furious, but he did it. He said he should have done it a week ago and he was sorry for making me fight for something that should have been obvious. I asked if he actually understood why this was a problem or if he just uninvited her to keep me from leaving. He thought about it for a long time before answering. He said he was starting to understand that he'd compartmentalized his relationship with Simone in a way that wasn't fair to me. He said he'd never thought of her as a threat because in his mind that relationship was completely over. But he could see now that maintaining contact without telling me was dishonest. It was the first time he'd actually acknowledged that he'd done something wrong beyond just poor communication. I asked if he was still in contact with any other exes and he said no. Simone was the only one. I asked why her specifically and he said honestly he didn't know. Maybe because the breakup was amicable and it seemed easy to stay friendly. Or maybe because his family liked her so much that it felt normal to keep that connection. I told him I needed him to cut contact completely if we were going to move forward, not just for the wedding but permanently. He agreed without hesitation this time. He said he'd send her a message explaining that it wasn't appropriate to maintain a friendship given the circumstances and he wished her well. I watched him type it out and send it right there in front of me. Update 5 days later. The wedding is in 1 week and everything has completely fallen apart. I don't even know if there's going to be a wedding at this point because of what happened with Derek's family and what I discovered about the real reason Simone was so important to all of them. After Derek uninvited Simone and sent that message cutting contact, I thought we were finally moving past this. We spent the next day being relatively normal with each other. He was attentive and kept apologizing and I was trying to let go of the anger and focus on the fact that we were getting married soon. I wanted to believe we'd gotten through the worst of it. Then Derek's mom called him. I could hear her voice through the phone even though he didn't have it on speaker. She was furious, screaming about disrespect and how could he uninvite Simone after everything she'd done for their family. Derek kept trying to calm her down but she wouldn't stop. Finally he told her he had to go and hung up. He was visibly shaken. I asked what she meant by everything Simone had done for their family. Derek got quiet and said his mom was just upset and exaggerating, but the way he said it made me suspicious. I pressed him on what specifically Simone had done and he said she'd been supportive during his dad's health crisis, which he'd already told me. I said there had to be more to it based on how his mom was reacting. Derek sat down and put his head in his hands. I waited because I could tell he was deciding whether to tell me something. After what seemed like forever he looked up and said Simone had loaned his family money 6 years ago when his dad was sick and couldn't work. It was a significant amount, around $30,000, and they'd paid most of it back but still owed her about $8,000. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked why he never mentioned this before and he said it was complicated and embarrassing. His family had been in a bad financial situation and Simone had helped without being asked. She'd apparently inherited money from her grandmother and offered it to them when she found out they were struggling. Derek said at the time it seemed like a generous gesture from someone who cared about them. I asked if they had a formal repayment plan and he said not really. They'd been paying her back in small amounts over the years whenever they could. She'd never pressured them about it but it was always there in the background. I asked if that was why his family was so insistent on her being at the wedding and he admitted that was probably part of it. They were indebted to her in more ways than one. This changed everything. Simone wasn't just an ex-girlfriend his family liked. She was someone they owed money to, someone who had financial leverage over them. I asked Derek if he thought Simone expected to be part of his life permanently because of the loan and he said he didn't think so but he couldn't be sure. I asked if she'd ever held it over them and he said no, never directly, but the debt itself was enough. I needed air so I went for a walk. It was late afternoon and the neighborhood was quiet. I just kept circling the same few blocks trying to process this new information. Derek had hidden not just a friendship with his ex but a financial entanglement between her and his family. Every time I thought I understood the situation it got worse. When I got back to the apartment Derek was on the phone with his dad. I could only hear his side of the conversation but it sounded like his dad was also upset about Simone being uninvited. Derek kept saying it was his decision and he was sorry but it wasn't appropriate for her to be there. His dad said something that made Derek go pale. He hung up shortly after. I asked what happened and Derek said his dad told him Simone had called crying about being uninvited. She'd apparently said she was hurt after everything she'd done for them. Derek's dad suggested maybe we should reconsider because Simone had been nothing but kind to their family. I asked if his dad mentioned the $8,000 they still owed and Derek said no but it was implied. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how Simone had positioned herself in Derek's family, loaning them money during a vulnerable time and staying close to them for years afterward. It seemed calculated in a way I couldn't quite articulate but deeply unsettled me. I wondered if she'd always hoped Derek would come back to her and if the loan was part of keeping that door open. The next morning I did something I probably shouldn't have. I messaged Simone directly. I know I'd ignored her first text but I needed to understand her perspective. I asked her why she loaned Derek's family money and what she expected in return. I tried to keep the tone neutral but I was angry and it probably showed through. She responded within an hour. Her message was long and detailed. She said she'd loaned them the money because she cared about them and they needed help. She insisted there were no strings attached and she'd never expected anything in return except maybe gratitude. She said she was hurt that I saw her gesture as manipulative when it had come from a genuine place of love for people who'd treated her like family. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She wrote that she and Derek had talked about getting back together a few years ago, after she'd loaned the money and before he met me. They'd apparently discussed whether they'd grown enough as individuals to make it work this time. Ultimately they'd decided they were better as friends but she admitted part of her always wondered what if. I screenshotted the message and showed Derek as soon as he got home from work. He read it and went completely silent. I asked if it was true that they'd considered getting back together and he said yes. It was about 5 years ago. They'd met for coffee and talked about their lives and whether there was still something between them. He said they'd both agreed there wasn't but clearly Simone remembered it differently. I asked if that conversation happened before or after the loan and he said after, which meant Simone had given his family $30,000 and then explored rekindling the relationship. I asked if he thought the loan influenced that conversation and Derek admitted he'd wondered that himself at the time but convinced himself it was coincidence. Looking back now he wasn't so sure. I told Derek I needed complete honesty about everything or I was leaving, not just leaving the apartment but ending the engagement entirely. He nodded and said he understood. I asked if there was anything else he hadn't told me and he said there was one more thing. Simone had been at his brother's wedding 4 years ago, 2 months before Derek and I met. I couldn't process that. She'd been at a family wedding, dancing, and celebrating with all the people who'd be at our wedding. I asked if he'd brought her as his date and he said no. She'd come alone because she was close with his brother too. Apparently she'd helped his brother with a work connection that led to a job opportunity, so she'd integrated herself with multiple parts of Derek's family. I sat down because I needed to. I asked Derek if his entire family expected Simone to be a permanent fixture in their lives and he said honestly yes, they probably did. She'd made herself indispensable in small and large ways over the years and they'd come to rely on her presence. He said uninviting her from our wedding was probably the first time anyone in his family had set a boundary with her. That evening I called off work for the next day because I knew I couldn't function. I spent the night going through every conversation Derek and I had ever had about family and exes and honesty, trying to figure out if there were other signs I'd missed. I was angry at myself for not seeing this sooner, for not asking more questions about his past. The next morning Derek's brother called me. We'd always gotten along well so I answered. He said he'd heard about the situation with Simone and he wanted to give me his perspective. He said Simone was a good person who genuinely cared about their family but he understood why I was uncomfortable. He said if it were his wedding he probably wouldn't want an ex there either regardless of history. I asked him about the job connection Simone had helped him with and he confirmed it was real. She'd introduced him to someone at a networking event 3 years ago and it had led to his current position. He said he was grateful but he'd never asked her to do that. She'd just offered. I asked if he thought she did things like that to stay relevant in their lives and he paused before saying maybe. He'd never thought about it that way but it was possible. After that call I realized the situation was even more complex than I'd understood. Simone had woven herself into Derek's family through money and favors and emotional support. She'd made herself irreplaceable, and now that I was trying to establish boundaries everyone saw me as the problem. I was the person disrupting the system they'd all gotten comfortable with. I told Derek we needed to postpone the wedding, not cancel it but give ourselves time to work through this properly. He looked devastated but he didn't argue. He said if that was what I needed he'd support it. I said I needed to trust him again and right now I didn't. I needed him to prove that he could prioritize our relationship over his family's comfort and Simone's feelings. Derek called the venue and our vendors. Most of them were understanding given the circumstances. We lost some deposits but not as much as I'd feared. His family was less understanding. His mom called me directly and said I was making a huge mistake. She said Derek was a good man and I was throwing away our future over nothing. I told her it wasn't nothing and hung up before she could respond. Final update 3 months later. I'm writing this from Austin where I moved 6 weeks ago for a job I wasn't even looking for. Derek and I are no longer together and his family paid off the remaining debt to Simone within days of me leaving, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. After we postponed the wedding Derek's family went from cold to hostile. His mom sent me an email listing every expense they'd incurred for the wedding and suggesting I owed them reimbursement for my half. I forwarded it to Derek without comment and he called her immediately. I could hear him yelling through the apartment walls about how inappropriate that was. She hung up on him. His brother was the only one who stayed neutral. He'd text me every few days to check in and make sure I was okay. He told me their parents were angrier at Derek than at me because he'd chosen my side over Simone's. Apparently that was a betrayal in their eyes. I asked if they understood why I'd been upset and he said honestly no. They thought I was insecure and controlling. Derek and I tried to make it work for about 3 weeks after postponing. We went to one couples counseling session that was a disaster. The therapist asked Derek to explain this situation and he kept minimizing it, saying it was just a miscommunication about a guest list. I corrected him and said it was about 4 years of dishonesty and he got defensive. We didn't schedule a second session. The breaking point came when I found out Derek had met up with Simone again. His brother accidentally mentioned it during a phone call. He said something about Derek returning her grandmother's necklace and I went silent. I hadn't known anything about a necklace. Derek's brother realized his mistake immediately and tried to backtrack but it was too late. When Derek got home from work that evening I asked him directly if he'd seen Simone. He hesitated just long enough that I knew it was true. He said she'd texted asking if she could get back a family heirloom she'd loaned his mom years ago and he'd offered to drop it off to save his mom the awkwardness. They'd met at a coffee shop and talked for maybe 30 minutes. I asked what they talked about and Derek said mostly the wedding situation and how his family was handling it. She'd apparently been sympathetic and said she never meant to cause problems between us. I asked when this happened and he said 5 days ago, so he'd hidden it from me for almost a week. I told him I was done and I meant it this time. Derek tried to argue that it was innocent and he'd only hidden it because he knew I'd be upset, which was exactly the problem. He was still making decisions based on managing my reactions instead of being honest. I said I couldn't marry someone who defaulted to secrecy every time something was uncomfortable. He said I was throwing away 4 years over nothing and I said those 4 years were apparently built on him hiding things from me. We had a massive fight that night, the kind where you say things you can't take back. He accused me of never trusting him and I said he'd never given me a reason to trust him. He said his family was right that I was controlling and I told him to go marry Simone then since everyone clearly preferred her anyway. He left and stayed at his parents' house for 2 days. When he came back we had a calmer conversation about ending the engagement. I'd already looked into breaking our lease and found a sublet option. He seemed shocked that I'd moved that quickly, like he thought I'd been bluffing about leaving. I told him I'd spent 2 weeks trying to convince myself this was salvageable but I couldn't ignore my instincts anymore. Lauren helped me pack and move my stuff to her place within a week. Derek wasn't there when we cleared out my belongings. He'd texted saying it would be easier if we didn't see each other and I agreed. His brother stopped by though. He helped us load boxes and didn't ask questions. Before we left he hugged me and said he was sorry his family had made everything so difficult. I stayed with Lauren for 2 weeks while I figured out next steps. During that time Derek's brother told me their parents had taken out a loan to pay Simone the remaining $8,000. They did it 3 days after I moved out. I asked why the sudden urgency and he said he thought they wanted to clear any obligation to her in case Derek reconnected with her romantically, which made me nauseous. That's when I realized Derek's family had probably always seen me as temporary, someone who didn't understand their dynamics and history. They'd never fully accepted me because I wasn't Simone. I'd spent 4 years trying to fit into a family that was waiting for me to leave so things could go back to how they were. A recruiter reached out to me during my second week at Lauren's. She'd found my profile online and said a marketing firm in Austin was looking for someone with my exact experience. The salary was 30% more than I was making and it was a senior position with growth potential. I did a video interview that afternoon and got an offer 2 days later. I accepted immediately. It felt like the universe was telling me to get out and start over somewhere no one knew about Derek or Simone or postponed weddings. Lauren was sad I was leaving but she understood. She threw me a small going-away dinner with a few mutual friends and everyone was supportive. One friend asked if I'd told Derek and I said no. What I did next wasn't his business anymore. I found an apartment in Austin online, signed the lease remotely, and drove there with everything I owned packed into my car and a small U-Haul trailer. The drive took 2 days and I stayed in a motel halfway. I remember sitting in that motel room eating takeout and feeling terrified and relieved at the same time. I was starting completely over at 29 but at least I was free. The job has been incredible. My boss is a woman who built the firm from nothing and she's exactly the kind of mentor I've always wanted. My team welcomed me immediately and the work is challenging without being overwhelming. I'm leading a campaign for a major client that launches next month and if it goes well there's already talk of a promotion. My apartment is in a neighborhood called Hyde Park. It's small but it has hardwood floors and big windows and it's close enough to walk to coffee shops and restaurants. I bought new furniture because I didn't want anything that reminded me of the apartment I shared with Derek. Everything here is mine and chosen by me and that matters more than I expected it to. I heard from Derek once about a month after I moved. He sent an email saying he'd heard through mutual friends that I'd left town. He said he was in therapy working on his issues with boundaries and honesty. He apologized for everything and said he understood why I left. He said he hoped I was happy and doing well. The email sounded genuine but it also felt like closure he needed more than an attempt to reconcile. I wrote back a short response thanking him for the apology and wishing him the best. I didn't share any details about Austin or my new job or my life now. I kept it polite and final. I haven't heard from him since and I don't look at his social media because it doesn't matter what he's doing anymore. Derek's brother still texts me occasionally. Last week he told me Derek started dating someone new. He didn't say if it was Simone and I didn't ask. Part of me suspects it is but honestly I don't care anymore. Whatever happens with them is separate from my life now. I spent so much energy trying to understand their relationship but it was never my puzzle to solve. I've made friends here faster than I expected. My coworker invited me to a book club that meets twice a month and everyone in it has been welcoming. I went to a networking event last week and got drinks afterward with 3 women who work in adjacent industries. We're planning to meet up again this weekend. It's nice to build relationships that aren't connected to Derek or our shared history. Next month I'm going to Denver for a conference. The firm is sending me to represent our team and present on one of our successful campaigns. My boss said it's a huge opportunity to make connections and potentially bring in new clients. I'm nervous but excited. It's the kind of professional recognition I never got at my old job. Last week I signed up for a running group that meets on Saturday mornings. I've never been a runner, but I wanted to try something new and meet people outside of work. We did our first run this past weekend and I barely made it 3 miles, but everyone was encouraging. One woman invited the group to her place afterward for coffee and we ended up talking for 2 hours. My lease here is up in 10 months and I'm already planning to renew. Austin feels like home in a way that my old city never quite did. Maybe because I chose it for myself instead of staying somewhere because of someone else. Or maybe because no one here knows about the engagement or the failed wedding or any of it. I'm just Vanessa who moved here for work and is building a life. I talked to my mom on the phone yesterday and she asked if I had any regrets about how things ended. I told her honestly no. I wished I'd asked harder questions earlier, but I don't regret leaving. She said she was proud of me for choosing myself even when it was difficult. That meant more than she probably realized. So that's where I am now, single and living in a city I barely knew 3 months ago and genuinely happy with how everything turned out. I'm not grateful for the pain, but I'm grateful I found out who Derek was before we got married. I'm grateful I trusted my instincts even when his family told me I was wrong. And I'm grateful for the chance to build something that's entirely mine. The promotion decision happens in 2 weeks and my boss hinted I'm the front runner. I have drinks planned with the book club on Friday and the running group on Saturday and a full calendar of work projects I'm excited about. This is what my life looks like now and I don't miss the old one at all.